The specific quality of a late spring sun in the Pacific Northwest is a fragile, precious thing, and on that Friday, it was pouring liquid gold over the hood of our Subaru Outback. The sky was an impossible, brilliant blue, a stark contrast to the deep, almost black green of the endless evergreen forests flanking Interstate 5. In the distance, the iconic, snow-dusted peak of Mount Rainier presided over the landscape like a silent, white-robed god. It was the kind of perfect day that feels less like a reality and more like a memory you're already forming, a promise of goodness. In the passenger seat, my husband, Daniel, was drumming a complex rhythm on the dashboard, a habit he'd had since I met him. His handsome, clean-shaven face was relaxed, his dark hair catching the light, and the simple silver band of his wedding ring, a ring I'd placed on his finger a decade ago, glinted with each tap. In the back, nestled among overnight bags, my best friend Catherine was humming along to a throwback indie rock station, her fiery red hair a brilliant splash of color against the deep greens outside. A wave of pure, uncomplicated contentment washed over me. This was my life, my entire world, encapsulated in this vehicle hurtling north. Daniel Sutton, my husband of 10 years, the man I've met in a crowded university library and fallen for over whispered conversations about classic literature. He was my anchor, the steady, reliable force I'd built my life upon. And Catherine, or Kate, as I'd always called her, was the sister I had chosen. We'd navigated the treacherous waters of college admissions, first heartbreaks, and career anxieties together, our bond forged in late-night study sessions and cheap takeout. This weekend getaway, a trip to a quaint inn on the coast, was Daniel's idea, a complete surprise for me. Just the three of us, he had said with a broad, charming smile, the original trio reunited. I smiled at the memory, my hands loose and easy on the steering wheel. I still can't believe you managed to book the Salish Point Inn on such short notice, honey. I heard it's booked out for months. He reached over, his hand warm and firm as he squeezed my knee. Only the best for my girl, he murmured, his voice the low, reassuring baritone that had always made me feel safe. You work so hard, Leah. Between your job and managing everything at home, you deserve 1,000 breaks. From the back seat, Kate leaned forward between the seats, her familiar perfume filling the car. He's absolutely right, you know? You're a superwoman, Leah. You're always taking care of everyone else. It's about time someone took care of you. Her voice was a comforting balm, the unwavering support I'd come to rely on for 15 years. She was the one who listened patiently when I worried Daniel was stressed at work, the one who would show up with a bottle of expensive Oregon Pinot Noir and a pint of salt and straw ice cream after I'd had a bad week. She knew every tiny crack and seam in my marriage, or so I believed. I met her bright green eyes in the rearview mirror and gave her a smile brimming with gratitude. A sharp electronic ping from the center console broke the idyllic spell. Daniel snatched his phone with a swiftness that felt almost jarring. He angled the screen protectively away from me, his expression shifting subtly as his thumbs began to fly across the glass. It was a familiar little dance, one that always left a tiny, bitter taste in my mouth. Work? I asked, trying to keep my tone light, casual. He was a regional director for a tech firm, and his job was genuinely demanding. But sometimes it felt like his phone was a fifth limb, one that was far more interesting than I was. Yeah, just a last-minute fire to put out for the quarter-end report, he mumbled, his eyes still glued to the screen. You know how Henderson is, wants everything triple verified. I did. I knew all the names of his colleagues, all the reoccurring corporate dramas, all the excuses that kept him late at the office or glued to his screen. I had accepted them as the necessary sacrifices for the comfortable life he provided. I let it go, turning my attention back to the ribbon of highway, refusing to let a work email tarnish this perfect moment. Oh my God, turn it up, Kate chirped from the back, pointing a perfectly manicured finger toward the radio. A song by the Shins, a band that had been the soundtrack to our college years, was just starting. I cranked the volume dial and a wave of nostalgia washed over us. Soon we were all singing, our voices blending in a joyful off-key chorus, a symphony of blissful ignorance. Looking from my smiling husband, who had finally put down his phone, to my laughing best friend, I felt a profound, bone-deep sense of security. These two people were my foundation, the twin pillars that held up the entire architecture of my world. Nothing, I believed with every fiber of my being, could ever bring it all crashing down. The world didn't just tilt, it was ripped from its axis in the span of a single, heart-stopping second. One moment we were cresting a gentle hill on the I-5, the majestic silhouette of the Cascades to our right, the car filled with music and laughter. The next, a full-grown doe, its eyes wide with primal terror, leaped from the dense thicket of Douglas firs directly into our path. There was no time for conscious thought, only for a raw, instinctual reaction. My foot slammed onto the brake pedal with the force born of pure, undiluted adrenaline. The tires screamed in protest, a piercing, high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear the idyllic afternoon into jagged pieces. The heavy Outback, a car I'd always prized for its safety and stability, fishtailed wildly on the sun-warmed asphalt. "Leah!" Daniel yelled my name, a sharp, terrified sound that was immediately swallowed by the sickening, percussive crunch of metal impacting flesh and bone. My body was thrown forward with brutal violence, the seatbelt locking and biting viciously into my shoulder and clavicle, stealing the air from my lungs in a painful gasp. The world outside the windows became a nauseating, incomprehensible vortex of green, blue, and gray. I wrenched the wheel, overcorrecting, and felt the horrifying lurch as the rear of the car swung around. There was a catastrophic, deafening bang as we collided sideways with the steel guardrail, followed by the crystalline, explosive symphony of the passenger side window disintegrating. A million tiny, glittering diamonds of tempered glass rained down inside the cabin, sparkling like malevolent stars in the afternoon light. Then, an abrupt, profound silence descended. It was a deafening, ringing silence, punctuated only by the faint, ominous hiss of steam escaping the crumpled hood and the sad, tinny echo of the radio, still faithfully playing to a world that had ceased to listen. My forehead was pressed hard against the steering wheel, the horn blaring a continuous, mournful note into the sudden stillness. With a groan, I pushed myself back into the seat, my entire body a discordant symphony of agony. A sharp, throbbing ache began to radiate from my right temple, and my left arm felt as though it had been set on fire. "Daniel?" I croaked, my voice a raw, ragged thing I barely recognized as my own. I forced myself to turn to my right. He was slumped against the door, his head at an unnatural angle against the deployed side airbag. A dark, angry slash of red was blooming on his forehead, just below his hairline, but he was stirring, groaning softly. "Kate?" I twisted painfully in my seat, my neck screaming in protest. In the back, she was curled up into a tight ball, her hands covering her head, her body shaking with violent, gasping sobs. We were alive, battered, terrified, but alive. The relief was so immense it was physically painful, a wave of gut-wrenching nausea that washed over me. I fumbled with the release button on my seatbelt, my fingers feeling clumsy and disconnected, refusing to obey my commands. "Everyone, just stay still," I managed to say, the words casing of copper and fear. "It's okay. Help is coming. We're going to be okay." I repeated it like a mantra, a desperate prayer aimed at calming them, at calming myself. The acrid, terrifying smell of deployed airbag propellant and hot gasoline filled the small space. Through the nightmarish spider web of cracks in the windshield, I could see the deer, a still, broken shape on the shoulder of the road. The beautiful day had been irrevocably broken, its golden promise shattered into a million sharp, glittering pieces, just like the glass that now littered every surface of the car's interior. In that moment of pure shock and terror, my every thought was for them. My husband, my best friend. I had to protect them. I had to keep them safe. I had no idea that the real collision, the one that would truly obliterate everything I held dear, was still moments away. The wail of sirens grew from a distant, plaintive cry to a piercing, disorienting shriek that seemed to vibrate deep inside my bones. In what felt like both an instant and an eternity, the crash scene was flooded with the flashing red and blue strobes of an ambulance and a Washington State Patrol cruiser. The world outside our shattered bubble became a blur of purposeful movement and calm, authoritative voices. A firefighter pried open my jammed door, and gentle but firm hands held me out onto the gravel shoulder. I was dazed, my body a sprawling map of aches, bruises, and a searing pain in my wrist. But I refused to be led away from Daniel. They had him on a stretcher by the side of the road, his eyes fluttering open and then closed again. A concussion, a paramedic with a calm demeanor and kind eyes told me, and possible internal injuries. They needed to get him to the nearest hospital immediately. Kate, miraculously, had escaped with only minor scrapes and a burgeoning black eye. She stood beside me, her arm wrapped tightly around my shoulders, her body still trembling. "It's all my fault, Leah," she kept repeating, her voice choked with what I took for guilt-ridden sobs. "I distracted you. I made you turn up the music. Oh, God, I'm so sorry." "No, Kate, it wasn't you," I insisted, my voice hollow and distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "It was an accident, a horrible accident." The young paramedic who had been assessing Daniel knelt beside the stretcher. His name tag read Martinez. "I need to get his information for the hospital admission," he said, his voice a steady, professional anchor in the swirling chaos. "Does he have his wallet on him?" "Yes, it should be in the inner pocket of his jacket," I said, pointing to the crumpled blazer a state trooper had retrieved from the car and draped over the guardrail. I watched as Martinez reached into the jacket and pulled out the familiar, worn black leather wallet. It was a 10-year anniversary gift from me. I saw him flip it open, my mind still a thick fog of shock and a single, overriding concern for my husband. I just wanted to get to the hospital. I just wanted a doctor to tell me he was going to be fine. Martinez's professional calm faltered for just a fraction of a second. A strange look, a flicker of deep confusion mixed with something I couldn't quite place, perhaps discomfort or embarrassment, crossed his face. He pulled something out of the wallet's main sleeve, then he dug deeper and pulled out something else. He held up 2 laminated cards, one in each hand. They were identical in size and format, the wallet-sized copies of marriage certificates you get from the county clerk. I squinted, my vision still fuzzy at the edges. One was ours, I was sure of it. I recognized the official seal of King County. But the other one? It bore the seal of Multnomah County, Oregon. Why would he have that? A business trip thing? A misfiled document? The paramedic looked from the 2 cards in his hands to me, then to Kate, who was still clinging to my arm as if for dear life. His gaze was professional, yet it was laced with an undeniable, profound bewilderment. He cleared his throat, a small, awkward sound. "Ma'am," he began, looking directly at me before his eyes shifted to include Kate in his question. He held up the 2 documents so we could both see them. "I'm sorry, this is a bit unusual. The name Daniel Sutton is on both of these marriage licenses. I just need to confirm for our records. Which one of you is Mrs. Sutton?" The question hung in the air, thick and heavy and surreal, like the smell of gasoline. For a long beat, my brain refused to process the words. It was a nonsensical query, a garbled mistake born of a stressful, chaotic situation. I was about to let out a shaky, relieved laugh, to point to myself and say, "That's me, of course, I'm his wife," when I felt Kate's arms stiffen against my back. Her grip on my shoulder, meant to be comforting, tightened into something sharp and painful like a talon. I turned my head and looked at her. The tears that had been streaming down her face were gone. Her expression was one of pure, unadulterated panic. Her face, that had been pale with shock just moments before, was now a ghostly, ashen gray. The blood didn't just run cold in my veins, it turned to ice, freezing me from the inside out. A vast, black, silent void opened up in the pit of my stomach. The paramedic's question echoed again in the ringing silence of my mind, and suddenly, The impossible, the unthinkable, the absolutely ludicrous answer was staring right at me, reflected in the wide, terrified green eyes of the woman I had called my best friend for half of my life. The hospital was a disorienting labyrinth of antiseptic smells, hushed urgent voices, and humming fluorescent lights that cast a sickly greenish pallor on everything and everyone. They put me in a small, curtained-off cubicle in the ER to check my own injuries. A mild concussion and a hairline fracture in my left wrist, the young doctor told me with detached sympathy. But the physical pain was a dull, distant signal from a faraway planet compared to the roaring, all-consuming inferno in my mind. The paramedic's question replayed itself on an endless, torturous loop. Which one of you is Mrs. Sutton? After what felt like an eternity of being prodded and questioned, a nurse informed me that Daniel was awake, stable, and settled in a room on the third floor. Catherine was already with him. The word sent a jolt through me. I brushed past the nurse, ignoring her suggestion that I should rest, my movements stiff and robotic, as if my body were being piloted by someone else. I found them in room 312. The scene that greeted me was so grotesquely domestic, it stole the breath from my lungs. Daniel was propped up on the sterile white bed, a fresh bandage stark against his dark hair, and Kate was sitting in the visitor's chair beside him, holding his hand. Not my hand, his. They were holding hands. They both looked up as I entered, their faces a synchronized portrait of guilt, apprehension, and naked fear. "Leah," Daniel started, his voice weak and raspy. "Leah, I know how this looks. Just let me explain." "Explain?" The word came out as a strangled, guttural whisper. I took a step forward, then another, my gaze locked on their intertwined hands. As if burned, Kate snatched her hand back, tugging it into her lap. "Explain what, Daniel? Explain the second marriage certificate in your wallet, the one from Mononama County, the one with your name and her name on it?" I finally managed to lift my arm, my hand trembling as I pointed a finger at Kate, who shrank back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the linoleum floor. "What is going on?" Daniel sighed, a long, weary sound of complete and utter resignation. It was the sound of a man who had been running a marathon of deceit and had finally, irrevocably been caught. "Leah, it's complicated." "No, it's not," I shot back, my shock and grief beginning to transmute into a cold, diamond-hard rage. "It's not complicated at all. I am your wife. We have a marriage certificate from King County, but you, apparently, also have a marriage certificate from Oregon with her. That's not complicated, Daniel. That's a crime. I believe it's called bigamy." "We were going to tell you," Catherine mumbled from her chair, her voice so faint it was almost lost in the hum of the hospital equipment. "We were trying to find the right time. We love each other." The sheer, staggering audacity of her words sent a jolt of white-hot fury through me, so powerful it made me dizzy. "The right time?" My voice rose, cracking with the hysteria I couldn't control. "The right time to tell me that my husband and my best friend are not only having an affair, but are secretly married? That my entire life, my entire 10-year marriage is a pathetic, disgusting lie? Were you going to tell me on our getaway? Was the car crash the right time? You love each other. What about me, Kate? Did you love me when you sat in my kitchen, drinking my wine, listening to me worry about him?" Daniel flinched, closing his eyes as if my words were physical blows. He opened them again and began to speak, his voice a flat, defeated monotone. The confession spilled out of him.
the second life in Portland, the secret condo in the Pearl District he'd bought with her, the wedding 2 years ago, a small courthouse affair he had passed off to me as a mandatory leadership summit for his company. Catherine, my confidant, my shoulder to cry on, had been his other wife all this time, living a parallel life, listening to my marital problems with a sympathetic ear, all while she was the root cause of every single one of them. My world didn't just shatter. It was being methodically, sadistically, and completely dismantled before my very eyes, piece by treacherous piece. I stare at the two of them, the man I had adored, the woman I had trusted implicitly, and I felt a terrifying, hollow void. The love, the warmth, the decade of shared memories, hopes, and dreams all evaporated in the sterile fluorescent light of that hospital room, leaving behind nothing but an Arctic cold. I turned without another word and walked out, leaving them in the thick, suffocating silence of their shared betrayal. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing with absolute, chilling certainty. I was no longer the victim of their lie. I was about to become the architect of their downfall.
The Uber ride back to our house was a silent, surreal journey through a city that no longer felt like mine. The familiar Seattle streets, the lush greenery of the neighborhoods, the charming craftsman houses, it all looked alien, as if I were seeing it through a distorted lens. When I finally stood before my own front door, fumbling with the keys in my shaking hand, I felt like a trespasser about to break into a stranger's life. This wasn't my home, it was a stage, a meticulously constructed set for a decade-long play in which I had been the unwitting, foolish lead. The moment I stepped inside, the carefully curated illusion of our life together assaulted me from every angle. On the mantelpiece, a framed photo from our wedding day at Golden Gardens Park. Daniel and I beaming, the Olympic mountains majestic in the background, his arm wrapped securely around my waist, in a gesture I now understood as possession, not protection. On the refrigerator, a magnet held a snapshot of Kate and me, arms slung around each other at a 4th of July barbecue last summer, both of us laughing with what I thought was genuine joy. Lies! All of it. The very air in the house felt thick and heavy with the poison of their betrayal. I walked numbly through the rooms, my fingers trailing over the furniture, the books we'd collected, the artwork we'd chosen together. I touched the life we had supposedly built and felt a cold, creeping revulsion. This was not a home filled with love. It was a crime scene, and I had been living with the perpetrators. My grief, which had been a hot, messy, chaotic storm in the hospital, had now crystallized into something cold, sharp, and purposeful. It was no longer a burden. It was a weapon. I wasn't going to collapse. I was going to dig. My crusade began in his office, the one room in the house that was exclusively his domain. I'd always respected his privacy, believing the long hours he spent cloistered in here were for his demanding tech job. Now I saw it for what it truly was, his command center, the headquarters for his deception. I started with his polished oak desk, pulling open the drawers with a cold, methodical vengeance. Beneath a neat stack of old tax returns, tucked into a manila folder labeled MISC, I found it. A second cell phone, a cheap, anonymous burner phone. I pressed the power button, my heart pounding, praying it had a charge. The screen lit up. No password. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. The screen opened to a string of text messages between him and a contact simply labeled K. The messages were a brutal, unfiltered chronicle of their secret life, a transcript of my humiliation. Can't wait for this weekend, my real wife. Just have to get through another performance with Leah. She doesn't suspect a thing. Another, sent just last week. Don't worry, baby. The coast trip will be fine. It'll make her feel secure. Then we can finally figure out our next move. The words were like acid, burning away any last vestige of pity or heartbreak and might have harbored. In the back of his walk-in closet, hidden away in an old shoebox from a pair of expensive dress shoes I'd bought him for his birthday, was the mother lode.
a deed to a condominium in Portland's Pearl District in both his name, Daniel Sutton, and hers, Catherine Albright. Bank statements from a joint savings account with a Portland-based credit union I never knew existed, with tens of thousands of dollars systematically siphoned from our shared finances under the guise of investment ventures. And photos, dozens of them. Daniel and Kate on a ski trip to Mount Hood, a place I'd always wanted to go. Daniel and Kate at a different Christmas party, with a group of smiling strangers I didn't recognize. They had an entire social circle, an entire world built in the shadow of my own. He hadn't just been cheating, he had meticulously built and maintained an entire duplicate life, and I was the inconvenient, trusting subplot in his real story. I carried it all downstairs and laid it out on the dining room table. The burner phone, the damning bank statements, the deed, the photos, their origin marriage certificate. I stood over it all, not as a heartbroken wife, but as a prosecutor meticulously arranging the evidence for an irrefutable case. This house was no longer a home. It was my war room, and I was going to battle.
The next morning, I walked into the gleaming downtown Seattle office of Vance & Associates, a law firm with a reputation as sharp and unyielding as the city's modern skyline. My hands, steady now, clutched a large leather portfolio filled with the meticulously organized evidence of my husband's treachery. I was no longer the dazed, injured woman from the crash scene. My grief had been forged overnight into a cold, hard resolve. My movements were deliberate, my expression a mask of controlled fury. I had secured an emergency consultation with the firm's senior partner, a woman named Eleanor Vance, a divorce attorney whose courtroom reputation was legendary. They called her the shark in the Chanel suit. She was exactly what I needed. I sat across from her vast, polished mahogany desk, which overlooked the gray-blue waters of Elliott Bay, and I laid out the entire sordid story. My voice was even, clinical, betraying none of the seismic emotional upheaval I felt inside. I presented the burner phone, the bank statements detailing the financial drain, the deed to the Portland condo, and the wallet-sized marriage certificate from Multnomah County. Eleanor listened intently, her sharp, intelligent eyes scanning each document I placed before her, her expression unreadable. She didn't offer a single word of pity or a hollow platitude. When I finally finished, she leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. It was the most comforting expression I had seen in 48 hours. "Mr. Sutton has been a very, very foolish man, Leah," she said, her voice smooth as silk but with an undercurrent of case-hardened steel, "and a deeply criminal one. Bigamy is a Class C felony in the state of Washington. He could face actual prison time, not to mention the automatic voiding of your marriage should you choose that path." The words sent a shiver of profound, righteous vindication through me. "And Catherine?" I asked, my voice tight. "What happens to her?" "Accomplice to a felony, at the very least," Eleanor said, tapping a perfectly manicured finger on the fraudulent bank statements. "And then there's the civil suit. Fraud, conversion of marital assets, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Oh, we are going to have an absolute field day with this. We will dismantle them, brick by brick." She began to lay out the legal path forward with chilling efficiency. We could file for divorce immediately, citing adultery and bigamy, which would give me enormous leverage. We could go to the King County prosecutor and press criminal charges. We could sue them into financial oblivion. But as she spoke, a different, more satisfying idea began to form in my mind. A quiet, clinical, legal annihilation wasn't enough. They had not just broken laws, they had humiliated me privately for years. They had turned my life into a public performance without my knowledge. Their downfall, I decided in that moment, needed to be just as public. "There's something else," I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping. "Our 10th anniversary is in 3 weeks. I had been planning a large party at our home. Caterers are booked, invitations sent. All our friends, his business partners from the tech world, his parents from Bellevue."
Eleanor's smile widened. Go on. I explained, my memory of his pathetic, pleading voice filling me with contempt. He's been calling me nonstop from the hospital, begging me not to do anything rash. He says he'll end it with her immediately, that he only loves me, that it was all a terrible, insane mistake. He thinks I'm considering it. He thinks I'm weak and broken. And you are not, Eleanor stated, not as a question, but as a clear-eyed fact. No, I said, my voice as hard as the marble floor beneath my feet. I'm not. I want the party to go on. I want them both there. I want him to stand up in front of everyone who respects him, everyone whose opinion he values, and I want to expose him for exactly what he is. For a long moment, Eleanor Vance, the most feared attorney in Seattle, just looked at me. Then she gave a short, sharp nod of profound approval. Leah Sutton, I like your style. Let's plan one hell of an anniversary party. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor and I operated like generals planning a complex military invasion. She handled the intricate legal filings, preparing to have them served at the most dramatic and devastating moment possible. I handled the party logistics, slipping into the role of the conflicted, wounded, but potentially forgiving wife. I spoke to Daniel on the phone, my voice intentionally soft and hesitant. I let him believe his desperate apologies were working. I even agreed to let Kate come to the party, telling Daniel with a feigned tremor in my voice that it was the only way I could ever face her, look her in the eye, and get the closure I needed to even consider moving forward. They walked right into the meticulously crafted trap, blinded by their own colossal arrogance and my masterful performance of weakness. They thought they were managing a crisis. They had no idea they were marching towards a public execution. The night of the party was unnervingly, cruelly perfect. The air was crisp and clear, and the sprawling backyard of our house was transformed into a scene from a magazine. Strands of fairy lights were strung between the tall cedar trees, casting a soft, magical glow over the 100 or so guests mingling on the manicured lawn. The gentle murmur of conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, a soundtrack to a life that was about to be spectacularly detonated. I had chosen my armor with care, a stunning floor-length dress in a shade of deep, vengeful crimson. It was the color of love and the color of war. From my vantage point on the deck, I watched Daniel work the room. He was in his element, the charming, successful tech director, accepting handshakes and claps on the back for a decade of what everyone believed was a happy, stable marriage. He looked relieved, a man who thought he had successfully navigated the most dangerous storm of his life and was now sailing back into calm waters. He actually believed he was going to get away with it. And Kate was there too, a ghost at the feast. She lurked near the edges of the crowd, playing the part of the somber, concerned friend, there to support Leah. She wore a pale, innocent-looking blue dress, a pathetic, transparent attempt at projecting a virtue she did not possess. They both shot me nervous, questioning glances throughout the evening, and I returned each one with a small, fragile smile that I hoped promised forgiveness, but was in reality sealing their fate. At precisely 9 p.m., as Eleanor and I had choreographed, I stepped onto the small, raised platform we'd set up for the band, tapping a champagne flute with a knife for attention. The crowd quieted down, turning towards me with warm, expectant smiles. Daniel, playing his part to the hilt, moved to my side, slipping a proprietary arm around my waist. It was a performative gesture for the audience, and it made my skin crawl. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "You're doing great, honey. See? We're going to get through this, I promise." I had to use every ounce of self-control not to recoil. I took a deep breath and began to speak into the microphone, my voice clear and strong, ringing out across the suddenly silent yard. Thank you all so much for coming tonight to celebrate with us. 10 years. It's a long time. It's a milestone that deserves to be celebrated with the people we love. A decade of marriage is about so many things. love, partnership, trust, and above all, honesty. I paused, letting the words hang in the cool night air. I looked directly at Daniel, whose charming smile was beginning to look strained and brittle at the edges. And I have learned so much about trust in these last few weeks, I continued, my voice gaining an edge of steel. For instance, I trusted my husband, Daniel, when he told me he was flying to Portland for a mandatory leadership summit for his company 2 years ago. A low, confused murmur rippled through the guests. Daniel's arm tightened on my waist, a silent, desperate warning. I ignored it and gracefully stepped away from him, creating a chasm of open air between us. But as it turns out, he wasn't at a leadership summit. He was at the Multnomah County Courthouse, getting married. A collective audible gasp sucked the air out of the yard. Phones previously hidden began to emerge. And I've learned so much about friendship, I went on, my gaze sweeping across the stunned faces until it landed on Kate, who was frozen by the bar, her face a mask of pure, abject horror. She lurked near the edges of the crowd, playing the part of the somber, concerned friend, there to support Leah. She wore a pale, innocent-looking blue dress, a pathetic, transparent attempt at projecting a virtue she did not possess. They both shot me nervous, questioning glances throughout the evening, and I returned each one with a small, fragile smile that I hoped promised forgiveness, but was in reality sealing their fate. "What is this, Leah? Have you lost your mind?" Daniel hissed, grabbing for my arm. I shook him off with a force that surprised even me. "This," I said, my voice ringing with the clarion call of righteous fury, "is called justice." At that precise, perfect moment, two professionally dressed individuals, a man and a woman, stepped through the side gate, their movements calm and purposeful. The man walked directly up to Daniel. "Daniel Sutton, you've been served." He handed a thick, ominous envelope to a stunned Daniel. The woman made a beeline for Kate. "Catherine Albright, you've also been served." The crowd parted around Daniel and Kate as if they were leopards, leaving them isolated in a sea of their own wreckage. In one swift, glorious, and utterly devastating move, their double life was not just over, it was annihilated in a spectacular blaze of public humiliation.
6 months later, I sat on the covered porch of a small, charming craftsman house in Fremont, a house I'd bought with the substantial settlement from my divorce. It was smaller, less ostentatious than the grand stage of a home I'd shared with Daniel, but it was mine. Every wall, every floorboard, every window that let in the soft Seattle light belonged to me and me alone. The autumn sun was surprisingly warm on my face, and a gentle breeze rustled the golden leaves of the giant maple tree in my new front yard, a sound like a soft, peaceful sigh. The legal battle had been brutal, but astonishingly swift. Faced with Eleanor Vance's legal onslaught and the irrefutable evidence of bigamy and systemic financial fraud, Daniel and Kate had no ground to stand on. They had no choice but to surrender completely. Eleanor had been magnificent, a true shark, ensuring I received not only more than half of all marital assets, but also a significant portion of the money they had meticulously hidden in their secret Portland accounts. The criminal charges stuck. To avoid a harsher prison sentence, Daniel pleaded down to a Class C felony conviction, which came with 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and a permanent criminal record that instantly vaporized his high-flying tech career. His company fired him within a week of the party, citing their moral turpitude clause. Kate, facing similar charges as an accomplice, took a plea deal that left her with her own criminal record and financial ruin. The social fallout was absolute and merciless. Their story became a piece of lurid local gossip, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and charity events across the Puget Sound region. They were pariahs. Daniel's parents, deeply and publicly ashamed, had sent me a long, heartfelt letter of apology,
enclosing a check for the money they had given Daniel for the down payment on our house years ago. I heard through the grapevine that Daniel and Kate were still together, adrift in a lifeboat of their own making, bound not by love, but by their shared disgrace. They had fled the state, hoping to escape their past in some anonymous Sunbelt city. But in the digital age, their infamy would always be a single Google search away. I no longer felt the hot rage or the sharp satisfaction in their misery, only a distant, clinical sense of justice having been served. The fury that had fueled me for months had finally burned itself out, and in its place I found not emptiness, but a quiet, clean, and expansive peace. The party had been my final explosive act as a woman wronged. The months that followed were quieter, dedicated to the careful work of rebuilding. I went to therapy, learning to untangle my own identity from the decade of lies. I reconnected with my real friends, the ones who had rallied around me with fierce, unwavering loyalty, bringing me food, listening for hours, and reminding me of the strong woman I was before I became half of a fraudulent couple. I took a sip of my coffee, the rich, bitter taste a welcome clarity on my tongue. A realtor sign on the lawn across the street had a sold banner slapped across it. A young family was moving in, and I watched as their little girl, no older than 5, chased a bright red ball across the grass, her laughter bright and carefree in the autumn air. I smiled, a real smile that reached my eyes. My old world had been built on a foundation of lies, and it had crumbled spectacularly into dust. But from that rubble I had built something new, something smaller perhaps, but infinitely stronger. It was a life built not on the shifting sands of another person's deceit, but on the solid bedrock of my own hard-won strength and resilience. The sun warmed my skin, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt truly, completely, and indivisibly whole. The storm was over,